It basically started in 1976 when Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari Incorporated, sold the company to Warner Communications for about $28 million. Warner let Bushnell stay on as CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Atari, but under the new leadership of Warner Communications. And yeah, this relationship didn't last that long, since the new management didn't know anything about video games and they didn't like the way the company was run so far. So they started to make a lot of changes inside Atari, and yeah, this led to a lot of showdowns between Bushnell and his new bosses. And in 1978, Nolan Bushnell got fired after another heated discussion during a meeting. And Warner Communications made Ray Kassar the new CEO of Atari, and Ray Kassar was a picture book businessman. And it really must be mentioned, under his leadership, the sales of Atari increased from $75 million to $2 billion. And he also made Atari the fastest growing company in the history of America. So this is really impressive, but the business strategies that they used, those business strategies will sooner or later collapse and destroy a company, which they're gonna find out soon enough. A programmer, or let's say a video game programmer in the late 70s made about $15,000 to $50,000 a year at Atari. And they had 3 to 6 months to create and finish a game, and all by themselves, since back in the days every game was made by only one programmer. And yeah, programming a game for the Atari 2600 was everything but easy. The first cartridges that were made for the Atari 2600 only had 64 bytes of RAM and 2 kilobytes of ROM. Later cartridges had 128 bytes of RAM and 4 kilobytes of ROM. Later on, in the later 80s, the cartridges got bigger and the memory got bigger, but those were the two kinds at the beginning of the Atari 2600. Today, those numbers are pathetic, but even in the late 70s and early 80s, those things were pretty limited. And also, it's actually funny, the hardware designers only had one real goal when they made the console, and the goal was that it should run Pong. Atari figured that with the system capabilities and the software that is available for this system, there can be about 8 different games that can run on this system. But the video game programmers learned after some time to really think outside of the box and make the system do things that it never was supposed to do. And yeah, this was really pioneer work in the end. And the system was brand new, and in 1977, so like I said, the system was brand new, and the programmers who were hired, they got a developer kit and they got some manuals which told them the basics of the system, and in the end Atari said, here you go, let's make a cool game for us. And yeah, in the end it really was hard to create a game for the Atari 2600, and from those people who actually could make a game for the Atari 2600, not even a few amount of people were able to make a good game or a fun game that actually sold. So at the beginning a lot of people got fired because their games sucked in the end. And in 1977, when the system was released, the sales were pretty low, basically because from the first games that were released for the system, there were not many games that made people buy the system. I mean, the best games from 77 were Combat, which I guess came with the system, and Air Sea Battle. Those were the two best-selling titles at that time. But that all changed in 78, and in 79 actually the sales of the Atari 2600 went through the roof. And Atari made millions of dollars, which is okay, but like so many companies before and even today, they made one big mistake. They only saw the profit and not the people who were actually responsible for the success, the workers, or in this case the programmers. Programmers weren't rewarded for their work. They didn't get any kind of recognition or credits like their names on the game boxes. They also didn't get any kinds of royalties, only some lame promises about some bonus programs which weren't kept, and yeah, they were actually replaced by new bonus programs which were also not kept. And in 1979, a couple of programmers actually found out how much money Atari made with their games. And 4 programmers, Larry Kaplan, Bob Whitehead, Al Miller and David Crane, who were also known as, or let's say were also called the Fantastic Four by the other programmers, since they made most of the games for the Atari 2600 and some of the best games for that system, went to Ray Kassar and said, look, we know how much money the company makes with our games. And yeah, it's time that we get something in return. So we want our names on the game boxes of our games and some kind of royalties, since we are the reason for all this profit. And the response from Ray Kassar was, programmers are not more worth than the people on the assembly line who screw the systems together, and they are also that easily replaceable. So either you go back to work or quit your job. So they did. And only a couple of months later they started their own company, Activision. Activision was the world's first third-party video game developer, and they made Atari 2600 games. Like this one, Robotank, and now they had the name on the game boxes. This one is made by Al Miller. And all the money they made with their games went to Activision and not even $1 to Atari. So Atari did what every company does, who, when people interfere with their business, they sue. Since back then every video game was made by the same company as the as the system makers, let's call it like that, or let's say were made by the same company. So Atari made games for the Atari 2600, Fairchild Semiconductor made games for the Fairchild Channel F, and Mattel made games for the Mattel Intellivision, and so on. But after 2 years of a lawsuit, Atari lost, and they actually had to pay Activision around $25 million. Plus, now the market was open for third-party video game developers. This also had an effect on the programmers of Atari, but I'm gonna tell about this later on in the video. But since Larry Kaplan, Al Miller, Bob Whitehead and David Crane left Atari, a lot of other programmers at Atari thought about also leaving Atari, and actually for the same reasons. But the problem was that there were no real alternatives before Activision, and even after Activision started releasing games and making some good money, they, like I said, got sued by Atari, the biggest video game company at that time, and actually nobody would have ever expected that they would lost the lawsuit to Activision. And let's just think about it. I mean, if Activision actually would have lost, what would have happened? I mean, in the best case scenario, Activision would have been allowed to release games for the Atari 2600, but they had to pay royalties to Atari. And in the worst case scenario, Activision would have been forced to shut down the company, and I guess they would have had to pay a huge amount of money, and this would have been more than the company would have made so far. And I just guess that this would have ruined their lives. But in the end, this is all speculation, and this is one of those big what-if questions. But before I continue with the whole story, I just wanted to give you one more example about how well Atari rewarded their programmers for a good work. The year is 1980. A young programmer at Atari named Rob Fulop decided to make a conversion of one great arcade game, one of the most successful arcade games at the time, Missile Command. And yeah, like I said, he wanted to convert it to the 2600. And yeah, let's just say his conversion is as arcade perfect as it could get on the Atari 2600, and the game became an instant hit. Between 2.5 to 3 million copies were sold of the game, and yeah, again Atari made millions of dollars profit. And yeah, what was the reward for Rob Fulop? With his normal Christmas bonus check, he got also an envelope, and in this envelope was a certificate of appreciation, then a letter from Ray Kassar, in which he thanks him for his contribution to Atari, and thanks to his contribution to Atari, and he also got a coupon for a free turkey. Wow. So actually there was a lot of frustration since it didn't matter for the programmers if they made a decent game, a great game, or maybe even a hit, as long as they didn't make bad games or games that didn't sell, because then they had to leave Atari. Now I know I make it sound all bad and depressing, but actually working at Atari was a lot of fun, at least in the beginning, thanks to Nolan Bushnell. When Nolan Bushnell started Atari Incorporated, he wanted to get the best and creative programmers that he could get. And to accomplish that, he wanted to create a working environment with a lot of fun in the end. So at Atari, the programmers had game rooms with all the arcade games of that time, and they could use all those machines at any time that they wanted. Then they also had hot tubs next to their offices to relax. They also didn't have time management, so they could come in the morning, in the afternoon, or work through the night, or also they could also come in at the weekends. And every Friday afternoon they had a big party with a lot of alcohol, and since it was the 70s, also with a couple of women, and yeah, funny things to smoke. And because of all this, Atari was actually known as Party Company, and but in the end they still had to make games, and if they didn't make games or become too lazy or anything, then they also would have to leave Atari in the end. Interestingly, even after Nolan Bushnell got fired, a lot of those privileges weren't touched or changed by the new bosses. And yeah, I guess in the end they didn't care, as long as they made games and they didn't have to to share their profit in the end. But let's come back to the story. So Atari lost against Activision, and like I said before, this opened the market for third-party video game developers. And since the video game industry was booming at that time, a lot of companies also wanted to get a piece of that cake and started releasing video games. And there were a lot of great companies that started, like Parker Brothers or Imagic or Spectravision, CBS or Xonox, and also some other companies. And also funny thing, even Atari and Mattel had a short relationship where they made games for each other. And also another thing that I mentioned before is that at that time this also had an effect on the programmers at Atari, because a couple of programmers went to their boss and said, look, we got some offers from other companies, and yeah, they agreed to pay us more money and also share some royalties. I mean, we really like it here at Atari, but you know, money is money. So their boss called his boss and he talked to Ray Kassar, and this time Atari was terrified because they didn't want to lose more programmers to the competition, and all of a sudden Atari agreed to pay royalties to their programmers. They also got some releasing bonuses and some other stuff. They didn't get their name on the game boxes, but I guess if you start getting checks for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, I guess you can live with that. Okay, now one major drawback with all those third-party developers was that there was no quality control of games. So the market was flooded with hundreds of games, and even though there were a lot of great games, there were also a lot of bad games. And not only that, in 1982 there were also too many systems competing against each other. I mean, you had the Atari 2600, you had the Atari 5200, you had the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, the Vectrex, the Belle Arcade, the Arcadia 2001, the Magnavox Odyssey 2, which was also known the Philips G7000 in Europe, then the Coleco Gemini and the Fairchild Channel F. So in the end, the consumers were pretty confused, since there was nothing, or there was nobody who could tell them if this system or this game was good or not. So there was no internet, there was there were no TV shows about video games, and also no video game magazines. And in the end they had to believe more or less the commercials and also the game descriptions on the back of the boxes. And yeah, a lot of time those promised a little bit more than they could actually fulfill.